Welcome to the podcast An Ancient Language for a Modern Soul, Poemi Conviviali by Giovanni Pascoli. I'm here today with Professor Elisa Bizzotto. Elisa is Professor of English Literature at Università IUAV in Venice, Italy. She works on Victorian and pre-modernist literature, and her interests are primarily in reception studies, genre, and mythography. She specializes in aestheticism, decadence, and Anglo-Italian cultural intersection in the long fin du siècle. Today, we will talk about a poem called The Twins, which is the story of a boy and a girl who are turned into flowers. It's a retelling of Narcissus' story, the story of the boy who fell in love with his own reflection, and which we find in Ovid's Metamorphoses. You will hear the poem in the translation by James Ackers and myself, published in 2022 by Italica Press. The poem is read by Joanna Strafford. The music is played by Arianna Mornico at the Celtic harp and has been composed by Giovanni Tardini. The Twins is Pascoli's rewriting of a well-known myth, the story of Narcissus, which we find in Ovid's Metamorphoses, Book 3. In Ovid's book, Narcissus is a handsome young man, so handsome that he falls in love with his own image reflected in the water of a river, as he thinks that the image belongs to someone else. Unable to embrace his own reflection, he wastes away and is turned into a flower bearing his name, Narcissus, which in English is a daffodil. It's from this myth, actually, that the term narcissism derives, as it indicates a self-centered personality style characterized by excessive preoccupation with oneself. But in The Twins, Pascoli doesn't rewrite the myth as we find it in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Instead, he chooses another version, the one by Pausanias. Pausanias is a Greek author who lived in the 2nd century AD. He did not think that the story of Narcissus in Ovid's version was plausible, so he gave another interpretation, which is the one Pascoli follows. Narcissus had a twin sister who died, causing Narcissus to grieve, and Narcissus would find comfort in looking at his own image in the water, as he would see the face of his twin sister in his. In Pascoli's version, at the end of the story, both siblings are turned to flowers, but not daffodils. The boy is turned into a spring snowflake and the girl into a snowdrop. But we will get to that later. So let's for now listen to the first stanza.
What does a flower feel when a feeble life unfolds its petals? It feels what the girl felt then. A thin white flower blossoming slowly, her neck so weak, her mother's look could bend it. The snows were almost gone, dotting the mountains in patches, grass and willows greening, rivers brimmed with water, the northern hills still white. But she was whiter still, and thinner, a faint echo of tears, and she was gone.
There are some differences in Pascoli's version of Narcissus' story. First of all, the twins are not grown-ups, but they are children. The girl has just reached puberty when she dies, and from the text we can infer that the body of the girl does not withstand growth, which is seen as a force, although feeble. And I would like to focus on the original text, which says una molle forza di vita. Although feeble is correct, in Pascoli's molle, soft, invariably comes with a sexual connotation, as in the famous poem Nighttime Blooming Jasmine, a poem that you should really check out if you have the chance. So it seems that the girl dies before becoming a woman, before the development of her reproductive organs, which is a recurring theme in an author such as Pascoli, who was so obsessed with purity and motherhood. In a way, it's the same concept as in other poems of his, where there's a child or a boy dying prematurely, such as in The Kite. That's another great poem translated by poet Seamus Heaney. And here we find the same metaphor of the flower still in its bud, not fully blossomed. So in The Kite, for instance, Pascoli declares that it's a good thing for the boy to have died innocent and untouched by experience, and we can assume by pain and disappointment. When instead of a boy we have a girl, this notion has an added sexual connotation, as experience also comes to mean sex. Well, the idea of dying before acquiring experience, dying when still a child, is an idea that it's not typical of Pascoli only, but it's a trope in late 19th century European literature. We also find it in an English author whose influence in late 19th century culture was vast and profound, Walter Pater. Elisa, you have indeed researched the presence of Pater in late 19th century Italy and in Pascoli as well. Can you tell us a bit about the relationship between the two authors?
Oh, yes, of course, Helena. Walter Pater was born in 1839 and died in 1894. He was an English essayist, literary and art critic, and a key figure in the aesthetic movement. He is best known for his work Studies in the History of the Renaissance, which was first published in 1873 and then had three more editions during Pater's life. The Renaissance emphasized the notion of art for our sake and the pursuit of beauty as central to life. Pater's work blends philosophical reflection with rich evocative prose and explores the relationship between art, life, and experience. Pater was an extremely influential author in the late Victorian era and late 19th century Europe, in Italy as well. His impact on European decadent writers is undeniable. In fact, I would say his influence is clearly visible in an author like Gabriele D'Annunzio, who is recognized by most critics as the only true decadent author in Italy. Maybe because Pascoli has not traditionally been included in the list of decadent authors, as his profile is less clearly aligned with the category of decadence. His relationship with Pater has not been explored much. What we know, however, is that Pater was widely read among the Italian intellectuals writing for journals such as Il Marzocco and Il Convito, because these intellectuals were responsible for the diffusion of the aesthetic movement in Italy. Il Marzocco and Il Convito were advanced art and literature journals, and Pascoli knew them very well. As a matter of fact, his Poemi Conviviali were published in the latter magazine, in Il Convito. And even if Pater was not translated into Italian until 1912, which is the year in which Pascoli died, Pascoli must have read excerpts from Pater's works in French or discussed Pater's ideas. We also know that Pascoli was a lover of literature in the English language, in particular of Tennyson and Longfellow. And so it's definitely possible that he came across Pater's texts, although we have no trace of this encounter. What Pater and Pascoli seem to agree on is the notion of childhood as an exceptionally inspirational phase in the life of a person, and in particular in the development of one's artistic persona. It is during childhood that one encounters beauty in the form of amazement before nature or the universe, and beauty is just a concept born out of this primeval sense of wonder. On the other hand, childhood is also associated with the first discovery of pain and grief, and both authors seem to derive this idea from their own biographical experiences. We know of Pascoli's premature loss of his family, his father in particular, which informs his entire poetic production. This theme is also present in Pater's autobiographical works, such as his first fictional story, The Child in the House, published in 1878. He called it an imaginary portrait. This is the definition he gives of this story. The Child in the House is an idealized memory of childhood in which a young boy's awareness of the world around him blossoms. And this is an awareness of beauty and wonder, but also of death, as I said before. Fundamentally, we can say that both Pater and Pascoli were aware of the coexistence of childhood and adulthood in life, which is sort of a pre-Freudian definition of the subconscious. Childhood is not only a special phase in a person's development, but persists throughout life, and it becomes the very source from which artistic creativity stems.
That's interesting. So you said that awareness of the world blossoms, and you could not have used a more fitting expression, because I really want to go back to the very theme of the poem, The Twins, which is the association of childhood with death and with flowers.
Indeed. We find this trope in Pater as well. And as I said earlier, in both Pater and Pascoli, the notion of artistic genesis is associated to the belief in the universality and inevitability of suffering, whose consciousness occurs very early in life and is amplified by the child's inexperienced perceptions. Examples of this ontological and aesthetic principle are especially present in the fourth chapter of Pascoli's prose, The Little Child, Il Fanciullino, where the autobiographical speaker alludes to the grief that has always characterized his uneventful life. It is then developed in the seventh chapter, and this is one of the two sessions to be written in verse, in which the poet delivers lugubrious omens to the child that he was and still is. And here I quote, "And as a deathbed, do you know what I will preserve for you? Oh, roses as a deathbed, fallen from the black thorn, the sweet pain that used to be." End of quote. It is rather difficult, I find, not to perceive the stylistic and thematic contiguity of these lines to the epilogue of another story by Pater, which is called Emerald Athwart and was published in 1892. Emerald Athwart is a story in which the young protagonist's corpse lies, and I quote, "in a coffin almost hidden under very rich scented cut flowers." End of quote. While rose bushes merge with the overarching presence of death in the country churchyard where Emerald is being buried. There are indeed close analogies between this scene and the passage in The Child in the House, in which the protagonist evokes the deaths of his childhood companions by using floral imagery. So I quote a longer passage from The Child in the House. He would think he is the protagonist, called Florian de Lille, so we can see that the name itself, Florian, evokes floral imagery. He would think of Julian, fallen into incurable sickness, as spoiled in the sweet blossom of his skin, like pale amber, and his honey-like hair. Of Cecil, early dead, as cut off from the lilies, from golden summer days, from women's voices. And then what comforted him a little was the thought of the turning of the child's flesh to violets in the turf above him. End of quote. So, my idea is that Pater's descriptions from The Child in a House and Emerald Athwart are foundational for the creation of the trans-European decadent topos of the pale, fragile, or dead child, often associated to dying flowers. Flowers in both Pater and Pascoli are part of a decadent botanical vocabulary, we could say, that originates in Baudelaire's The Flower of Evil, and views nature as both the harbinger of life and beauty and of death.
Oh, thank you very much, Elisa. This is fascinating. Let's now go back to the story. After the girl dies, the boy looks for her, and he finds her in his own reflection in a river in a forest. Every day he goes there and seemingly talks to the girl in the water, who answers back with the same words. So the second difference with the source of the story in Pausanias' book is that Pascoli preserves the element of Narcissus' illusion, at least in the first part of the poem. Let's listen to another few stanzas.
Her twin asked his pensive father, who went quiet and looked away. Her twin then asked his lonely mother, who smiled to him and cried some more. Your sister walks on fields of flowers, merry, though without her twin. She's not alone, but in a buzzing swarm of blessed souls who feed on flowers, and you will join them too one day. But stay now, for if you go, you're gone. boy did go through woods and meadows, followed the bees, and the buzzing bees led him straight up to the riverbank. In the river, he found his sister. As he looked into the water below, the water showed his sister's face. As he was sad, she too was sad. But when he smiled, she smiled. He opened his mouth to call her name. Her lips did too to call that name. And who took you away? And are you happy where you are? But her reply then came too fast. Her lips moved as his moved too. He stopped talking. She stopped too. He started again, but so did she. And both misread, and thus they cried.
So it's the mother who reveals the illusion. The girl is not among us, she says, but she is in heaven. And the heaven depicted by the mother takes the form of a garden, an image that derives from classical literature and Greek mythology, where the Elysian fields were depicted as fields of flowers. But more specifically in Pascoli's poetry, the afterlife is depicted as the comforting garden, that nothing changes, a place shielded from pain. We can now listen to the poem's finale.
He understood. But many times he went again to that clear river to see his sister's face in his, living in him, who wasted away. It was the time when human sorrows fell like seeds and turned to blossom, a bud from the blood in our crimson veins, a gem from the tears of our endless pain. And he was a snowflake, and she a snowdrop, a snowflower, and a milk flower. He had then 3 petals only, and she had 3 with greenish tips. Both had white, recumbent heads. The crocus bloomed just when he died. Another youth, then turned to flower. He died too soon to see Hyacinthus, taken away by frozen winds. The twins had bloomed alone, early, with snows still on the northern hill and a few birds, once humans too, crying, yes, but to themselves, sweetly, softly, thinking how tuneful is the song born out of tears. The twins turned to thin flowers, but brief were their lives even as flowers. Theirs was a love before the season of love, or maybe it was pain that took them before spring.
So in the last stanza, the narration seems to take place in a mythical past that is common for all mankind. And it's back to this universal past that now Pascoli brings the narration as if it was a foundational myth that he's now revealing to narrate. The myth behind the existence of 2 very similar flowers, the snowflake and the snowdrop. Both are white flowers, as indicated by their Greek names, leukoios, the white flower, and galanthos, the milky flower. What these flowers have in common, besides the white color, is that they both blossom in early spring or at the end of winter, so they're early flowers. And so is the narcissus. And since I'm now based in England, one of the first signs of spring, to everyone's joy, is the sight of daffodils blossoming everywhere in March, dotting the fields and popping out at the side of the road.
Oh, so beautiful.
So here Pascoli lists other foundational myths having to do with young people who died and were turned to flowers, or birds. The crocus in Ovid's Metamorphoses Book 4 was originally a boy in love with a nymph who didn't love him back, so he pined for her and died. The hyacinth was a boy accidentally killed by his lover Apollo in Metamorphoses Book 10. And the birds mentioned there also come from Metamorphoses Book 6. This is actually a gruesome story. I'm not sure I should be telling it as it is, but Philomela had a sister named Procne who was married to the king of Thrace. And while this myth has several variations, the general storyline is that Philomela, after being raped and mutilated by her sister's husband, obtains her revenge and is transformed into a nightingale, a bird famous for its song. And because of the violence in this myth, the Song of the Nightingale is often depicted or interpreted as a sorrowful lament. So these are all stories in which the experience of pain is so strong that it dehumanizes people. Some are turned to flowers, some to birds. So poetry or art is steeped in the early experience of pain. In this poem, pain causes a premature death, which sort of imprisons the twins in an eternal childhood, preventing the development of adulthood, and especially in the case of the girl, of womanhood and sexuality. So this eternal childhood is also the quintessential condition for creativity, which remains throughout life, providing a balm to soothe the pain of existence. Well, thank you very much, Elisa, for being our guest today.
Thanks to you, Elena. It was my pleasure, and it was all very, very interesting. Thank you again.
Thank you. We're going to now let the listeners enjoy the full poem. Thank you all for listening.
What does a flower feel when a feeble life unfolds its petals? It feels what the girl felt then, a thin white flower blossoming slowly, her neck so weak, her mother's look could bend it. The snows were almost gone, dotting the mountains in patches, grass and willows greening, rivers brimmed with water, the northern hills still white. But she was whiter still, and thinner, a faint echo of tears, and she was gone. Her twin asked his pensive father, who went quiet and looked away. Her twin then asked his lonely mother, who smiled to him and cried some more. Your sister walks on fields of flowers, merry, though without her twin. She's not alone, but in a buzzing swarm of blessed souls who feed on flowers, and you will join them too one day. But stay now, for if you go, you're gone. The boy did go through woods and meadows, followed the bees, and the buzzing bees led him straight up to the riverbank. In the river, he found his sister. As he looked into the water below, the water showed his sister's face. As he was sad, she too was sad. But when he smiled, she smiled. He opened his mouth to call her name. Her lips did too, to call that name. And who took you away? And are you happy where you are? But her reply then came too fast. Her lips moved as his moved too. He stopped talking. She stopped too. He started again, but so did she. And both misread, and thus they cried. He heard his mother call him home, call the boy she thought was lost. Sister, come, he said to her. Hurry, come, you'll like it there. She did reply, but her anxious face mixed her words with what he'd said. Where's the flower they say you eat? The grass around you is empty. His mother called again, and his lips, cold and sweet, then touched the water. Goodbye, he whispered in a kiss. Goodbye, the water gurgled. The boy then left the riverbank, and the girl vanished. Mother! She's where you said, but she is lonely in lonely waters. I saw no face but her lonely one. I saw no swarm around her head except the one of the buzzing bees. No dear friends are there with her, no flowers either for her meal. Come, oh come and bring her home. Son, dear son, but God deceived you. She feeds on flowers but in heaven, and you're on earth, and heaven's far. It is hard to return once you go there. but it is easy enough to reach, no further than our garden wall." And the boy grabbed her hand in awe. "Let us go, if it is not far." He then bent down towards the river, and up again his sister came, with her mother's mournful face beside hers. "Mother, look how sad she is to see the sadness in your face." "Son, dear son, that is my face in the water, and the other is yours." A touch decreased the water, and girl and mother vanished in the gurgle. Then boy and mother came again, shaking in tears onto the water. He understood. But many times he went again to that clear river to see his sister's face in his, living in him who wasted away. It was the time when human sorrows fell like seeds and turned to blossom, a bud from the blood in our crimson veins, a gem from the tears of our endless pain. And he was a snowflake, and she a snowdrop, a snowflower, and a milk flower. He had then 3 petals only, and she had 3 with greenish tips. Both had white, recumbent heads. The crocus bloomed just when he died. Another youth, then turned to flower. He died too soon to see Hyacinthus, taken away by frozen winds. The twins had bloomed alone, early, with snows still on the northern hill and a few birds, once humans too, crying, yes, but to themselves, sweetly, softly, thinking how tuneful is the song born out of tears. The twins turned to thin flowers, but brief were their lives even as flowers. Theirs was a love before the season of love, or maybe it was pain that took them before spring.